Imagine a world untouched by one of the darkest chapters in human history. A world where the winds never carried the scent of decay through medieval alleyways, where bells didn't toll endlessly for the departed, and where towns and villages weren't wiped from the map by an invisible killer. What if the Black Death, the catastrophic pandemic that swept through Europe in the 14th century, claiming the lives of nearly half its population, had never occurred? No skeletal figure of the Grim Reaper haunting our collective imagination. No desperate cries echoing from quarantined homes. No priests overworked with last rites, no mass graves dug hastily under the weight of despair. What kind of world might we have inherited? Would the Renaissance, often seen as a phoenix rising from the ashes of this tragedy, have ignited earlier, fueled by uninterrupted progress rather than born of loss and upheaval? Or would feudalism, that rigid, oppressive hierarchy of lords and serfs, have continued its stranglehold over society without disruption? Today, we step into the shadows of an alternate timeline. One not shaped by plague and panic, but instead, by possibilities. We unravel the tapestry of history to explore what might have been, and perhaps, what should never have come to pass. In the middle of the 14th century, the world was forever altered by a silent, invisible enemy. It wasn't an army marching across borders, nor a tyrant demanding obedience. It was a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death. It arrived like a whisper and struck like a hammer, sweeping across continents with terrifying speed. Within a few short years, it erased between 75 to 200 million lives, an unfathomable portion of the global population. Entire communities vanished, cities stood silent, and the air grew thick with fear and the stench of death. Europe, once bustling with trade and tethered tightly to the feudal order, found itself in ruin. Economies collapsed. Traditional hierarchies, those rigid structures of kings, nobles, and peasants, buckled under the weight of sudden loss. Churches lost their authority as prayers went unanswered. Science, previously shackled by dogma, began to stir from its slumber. In this devastation, humanity was forced to confront its fragility, and in doing so, it set the stage for a reawakening. A rebirth. But imagine, just for a moment, that none of this had happened. That the pestilence never arrived on those doomed ships, that the rats and fleas never carried their deadly payload. No gruesome piles of bodies in the streets. No eerie silence replacing once thriving marketplaces. No desperate shortage of workers driving serfs to bargain for freedom. The old world, untouched, trudging on in its predictable, stagnant rhythm. Without the devastation of the Black Death, would labor have ever found its voice? Would the seeds of innovation have been sown in such fertile chaos? Or would monarchs and clergy have clung to power even more tightly, never forced to adapt or evolve? Today, we peel back the veil of what actually was and step boldly into what might have been. A world where medicine never faced its trial by fire. Where the established powers never cracked. Where the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, even the birth of modern democracy, may have all taken different paths, or perhaps never emerged at all. Get ready to reimagine everything you thought you knew about progress, power, and the profound cost of transformation. In the world we know, the Black Death didn't just claim lives. It shattered centuries-old structures, leaving cracks through which change could finally emerge. But in this alternate timeline, that great reckoning never arrives. The deadly tide that once swept away serfs, squires, merchants, and monarchs alike, never touches European soil. And so, the great wheel of feudalism keeps turning, uninterrupted, grinding generation after generation beneath it. Here, peasants remain firmly tethered to the land, by law, by tradition, and by the sheer absence of options. Without the sudden scarcity of labor that followed the real Black Death, there's no bargaining chip for the underclass. No incentive for lords to negotiate. No reason for the powerful to loosen their grip. The peasant is not a worker with value, but property, expendable and replaceable. His back bends to the will of his liege, just as his fathers did, and his sons will after him. In this world, there are no revolts like the English peasants' revolt of 1381. No uprisings driven by new awareness of worth, or the desperation of survival. The streets remain quiet, but not peaceful, only silenced. The social order persists, calcified and cruel. Lords dine in stone halls, oblivious to the hunger in the thatched cottages below. The plague that once emptied manors and village greens, creating a vacuum for change, has not come. And so, neither has the spark of social mobility. Without upheaval, there is no rise of the merchant class, no ambitious tradesman climbing the social ladder on the backs of shifting economies. Towns remain stagnant. Guilds lack the freedom to grow. The idea of the self-made man becomes a fantasy, crushed beneath the weight of titles and birthrights. The Renaissance merchant princes of Florence. Perhaps they stay lowly artisans, their fortunes stunted before they begin. The world remains stratified, suffocating under the unbroken reign of tradition. Innovation is seen as rebellion. Change is dangerous. The hierarchy is sacred. The age of the common man, his voice, his vote, his worth, isn't just delayed. It is denied. And history waits in vain for a rupture that never comes. The Renaissance, the rebirth of art, thought, and reason, did not arise from peace. It rose from ashes. It was the child of chaos, the answer to an era of death and despair. In our timeline, the Black Death ripped the fabric of medieval life to shreds, leaving a void where old certainties had once stood. And into that void rushed a new hunger, a hunger for knowledge, beauty, and meaning. A hunger to rebuild, not what had been lost, but something entirely new. But what if the darkness never came? In this alternate reality, there is no plague to shake Europe from its slumber. No death to make men question life. No silence to make them listen. The traditions of the medieval world remain intact, unchallenged and unquestioned. The church still holds a tight grip on thought, stamping out inquiry before it can spark. Scholarly curiosity remains chained to dogma. Philosophy remains frozen. And so, the great intellectual eruption that once reshaped the Western world never ignites. Yes, the printing press may still be invented. Perhaps Johannes Gutenberg still tinkers in his workshop, still dreams of movable type. But in a society not aching for answers, who reads? Who questions? Who cares? Without the urgency born of catastrophe, books may be printed, only to gather dust on forgotten shelves. Ideas need fertile ground to grow, and here, the soil remains untouched, undisturbed by the churn of revolution. Art, too, is stunted. There are no Medici patrons eager to immortalize themselves through beauty and knowledge. There is no flood of commissions to challenge form and technique. Michelangelo may remain an obscure sculptor, toiling anonymously in a workshop. Leonardo da Vinci, whose mind gave us flying machines and anatomical drawings centuries ahead of their time, might never be more than a skilled apprentice, painting altarpieces by rote, his genius confined by a society that neither needs nor wants it. Humanism, that profound shift in focus from the divine to the individual, may never rise. The idea that man is worthy of study, of expression, of dignity, remains buried beneath centuries of obedience and fear. In this world, there is no renaissance to awaken Europe, no enlightenment to follow. The torch of progress flickers weakly, its flame denied the oxygen of necessity. And so, a world without plague becomes, paradoxically, a world without renewal. In the 14th century, the Black Death didn't just silence prayers, it exposed the terrifying limits of human understanding. As bodies piled up and entire towns vanished, the church's promises of divine protection rang hollow. The old explanations, sin, wrath, divine punishment no longer sufficed. Faith was shaken. Certainty crumbled. And into that abyss crept something radical: curiosity. Faced with death on a scale never before imagined, humanity began to question not just the heavens, but the very nature of life and disease. In our timeline, this was the bitter seed from which science would grow. The plague revealed the ignorance of the age and demanded a reckoning. What is illness? Where does it come from? How can it be stopped? These weren't philosophical musings anymore, they were matters of life and death. But in this alternate world, one untouched by the Black Death, those questions remain buried. There is no surge in autopsies to understand the human body. No frantic need to trace infection from person to person. No rethinking of how disease spreads. Without the terrifying evidence of a killer that spared no king or peasant, germ theory remains unimagined, decades, maybe centuries, away. Medicine stagnates in the hands of barbers and monks. Bloodletting, superstition, and the balance of bodily humors continue to dominate treatment. Hospitals, if they exist at all, are not places of healing, but holding pens for the dying. Hygiene is a curiosity, not a necessity. Sanitation is irrelevant to a world that sees sickness as fate, not failure. Public health, a forgotten concept. There are no quarantines, because there is no understanding of contagion. Cities don't plan for cleanliness, because they don't recognize filth as a threat. There is no Florence that locks its gates. No Venice that isolates its ships. Without the trauma of plague, there is no push to protect the many at the cost of disrupting the few. And so, modern medicine, the tools, the knowledge, the mindset, remains unborn. The scalpel stays blunt. The microscope unused. The physician remains more mystic than scientist. In saving itself from the Black Death, this alternate world may have damned itself to centuries of ignorance. The cost of survival. Progress itself. Fast forward 2 centuries. The sails of European ships still rise on distant horizons. The age of exploration begins. But in this altered timeline, it's driven by a very different engine. In our world, the aftermath of the Black Death had transformed Europe. It had cracked open rigid social orders, given voice to the voiceless, and sparked a wave of innovation, curiosity, and bold ambition. Explorers sailed not only for gold and glory, but also with new technologies, better maps, and, crucially, a mindset no longer shackled by medieval thought. But here, in a world untouched by plague, Europe never had that transformation. It remains feudal, stratified, and stagnant. The merchant class, if it exists, is stifled. Ambition is curbed by inherited titles, not earned merit. Curiosity is still a sin, not a virtue. The ships still sail, but slower. The compass is cruder. The motivations, more desperate, less enlightened. Colonization, when it does come, arrives not as a wave of exploration powered by emerging science and statecraft, but as a raw extension of medieval conquest. Not Columbus backed by rising Spain, or da Gama serving a nation-state's strategic ambition, but fragmented feudal powers, each grasping for dominion, not discovery. The coordination is less. The brutality, possibly more. Because without the humanist ideals that began to blossom post-plague, without the hard-learned empathy born from shared suffering, there are fewer checks, moral or intellectual, on imperial behavior. The treatment of indigenous peoples, already horrific in our real timeline, may become even more barbaric. Not driven by a belief in civilizing the other flawed as that belief was, but by a pure, unfiltered lust for dominance. An iron boot with no illusion of justification. And what of resistance? In our timeline, the diseases brought by Europeans wiped out entire native populations. But here, the biology may differ. If Europe never underwent its own epidemiological firestorm, the microbes it carries into the New World might be less virulent. Native populations, less devastated by foreign plagues, may be better able to resist. The battlefield changes. So does the timeline. Colonization still happens, but it's longer, messier, and darker in a new way. It's not tempered by progress, or driven by trade, it is conquest, laid bare. The flags still rise, but beneath them lies a harsher world. And history, once again, takes a crueler turn. In this alternate timeline, where Europe's Great Plague never arrives to shake its foundations, the world map is redrawn, not by musket and sail, but by momentum long stifled in our reality. With Europe's rise stalled, its innovations delayed, its social structures fossilized, the door opens wider for other civilizations to chart history on their own terms. Across the East, the Ming dynasty stands at the helm of a different destiny. In our timeline, Admiral Jing his great treasure fleets were grounded by internal politics and conservative scholars. But in this new world, where European intrusion is slow, fragmented, and feeble, there is no external threat to justify isolation. China's fleets continue to sail across the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf, perhaps even to the shores of East Africa and beyond. The red sails of the dragon flag proclaim not conquest, but connection. Trade routes flourish. Maritime silk roads, not just the land-bound ones, become arteries of global exchange. Porcelain, spices, gunpowder, and philosophy move westward, not as exotic imports, but as dominant cultural exports. The cultural gravitational pull of Asia strengthens. Confucian ideas influence governance beyond China. Buddhist and Islamic traditions hold ground in global conversations on ethics, science, and cosmology. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the golden thread of knowledge continues uninterrupted. In our history, European colonizers carved up the Middle East and North Africa, plundering libraries, dividing empires, and installing puppets. But here, without aggressive European encroachment, the House of Wisdom never falls silent. Islamic astronomers refine celestial charts. Mathematicians build on algebra and trigonometry. Physicians debate anatomy using texts centuries ahead of Europe's medieval practices. The Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, less besieged, more stable, turn their energies inward, toward advancement, rather than defense. In Africa, kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Benin retain control over their trade routes and cultural identities. The trans-Saharan trade remains robust, linking sub-Saharan Africa with Mediterranean powers on equal terms, not as subjugated colonies, but as sovereign participants. European slave raids, if they happen at all, are sporadic and less systematized. The long shadow of transatlantic slavery may be shortened, or never fully cast. And so, a multipolar world begins to emerge. One where power isn't hoarded by a single continent, but balanced, tenuously, between rising giants. There is no British Empire sun that never sets. No European hegemony. Instead, we find rival centers of knowledge, influence, and identity. A world where Arabic might rival English as the language of science, and where a university, in Baghdad, or Nanjing might wield as much intellectual clout as any in Paris or Oxford. But make no mistake, diversity does not guarantee peace. Rivalries remain. Resource conflicts endure. Ideological clashes take new forms. Power, wherever it flourishes, always seeks expansion. The balance is not utopia, it is simply more complex. A world not led by one power, but by many. Not better. Not worse. Just profoundly different. And now, it's your turn to step into the shoes of a historian. If the Black Death had never happened, what would the world look like today? Would we still be living under the shadow of feudalism, or would the Renaissance have taken root much sooner? What would science and exploration look like in a world where the darkest chapter of the Middle Ages never occurred? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop your theories in the comments below, and we'll be diving into all of them. Whether you're thinking about politics, culture, or even the way we eat, this is your chance to shape an alternate history. And if you've enjoyed this journey through time, questioning, imagining, and exploring all those what ifs, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. We have plenty more mind-bending alternate realities to uncover, and we'd love for you to join us on the next adventure. History isn't just a list of dates and events. It's a window into what could have been, a glimpse into countless alternate realities that might have unfolded if fate had turned a different way. The Black Death was one of the most tragic events in human history, a catastrophe that claimed millions of lives and left Europe broken. But, in its aftermath, it also cracked open the rigid, stagnant structures of medieval society. It was a brutal catalyst for the Renaissance, for the rise of science, for a new worldview. Progress, whether we like it or not, came at an enormous cost. But in this alternate timeline, a world without the plague would have taken a much different path. Sure, we might have seen less pain, fewer deaths, less devastation, but would we have had the same explosion of creativity, the same scientific breakthroughs, or the same societal changes that reshaped the course of history? In a world where no one was forced to rebuild from the ashes, might we have seen a slower, more complacent progression? A world without urgency, without the pressure to innovate or adapt. In this reality, perhaps life would have been safer, but it would have also been smaller. Less change. Fewer bold ideas. A world where things, society, art, science, moved at a more predictable, even stagnant, pace. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? How much of what we take for granted today, the technology, the freedom, the knowledge, was born from tragedy and loss? Maybe that was the price of our progress. So, what if the plague had never struck? Would we have reached the same heights of civilization? Or would we have stayed trapped in a world too comfortable to change? Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more deep dives into alternate histories. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons aren't just from the history we've lived through, they are from the roads we never took.